Hello, citizens of Fawcett City, and welcome to Circuit Court Entertainment, where we discuss how laws and history affect all forms of media. I'm your host, Mina, and today we are discussing why and how DC and Marvel Comics both have a hero named Captain Marvel. It is a tale of specifics and some of the most comic book sentences I have ever read. Let's get started. And to start, we begin with Superman. Superman debuted in 1938 as one of the first comic book superheroes, designed by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, whose own legal exploits are an entire other episode. Superman is one of the most iconic superheroes ever, so I won't recap everything. Also, go watch My Adventures with Superman, it's good. What I will say though, as this is important, is aspects of what we consider the Superman power set were added over time. Kryptonite was first used in the radio serials in 1943, but didn't make its comics debut until 1949. Flying debuted in either the 1940 radio serial or the 1941 Fleischer cartoons, and the comics adopted it in 1943, and so on. We don't have exact numbers, but judging from the amount Superman published and the tie-ins, it sold very well. And like many things that sold very well, there were copies. Captain Billy's Whiz-Bang was not, as I found out while researching this episode, a made-up thing that sounded scandalous for the We Got Trouble sequence in The Music Man, but a real magazine founded in 1919, to my credit, after The Music Man takes place, and aimed initially at World War I soldiers. This demographic did eventually expand, and multiple magazines were published by the Fawcett family. Their main line was a home repair magazine called Mechanics, with an X, but individual magazines covered quite a bit, from detective stories to romance stories called True Confessions, to something called Rudder, which I'm assuming deals with boats. And when superhero comics started to grow, Whiz Comics was added onto it. Now, while Fawcett did publish titles like Ibis the Invincible, Spy Smasher, and Captain Midnight, their most famous one, and the one we are talking about today, is Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel debuted in December 1939. Billy Batson is a homeless kid who is told by a wizard that when he shouts Shazam, he will turn into the superhero Captain Marvel to fight evil. At that point, well, the colors are different, but the outfit and silhouette are broadly similar to Superman's outfit. Though while Superman had them the whole time, Billy could only do it while he was Captain Marvel. Their powers were similar too. Super strength, tough skin, high jumping since neither could fly then, and an evil scientist as a villain. Captain Marvel had Dr. Sivana. Superman had the Ultra-Humanite, who got retired and later returned as an albino gorilla, because comics, and later Lex Luthor. Though that's not to say Dr. Sivana isn't an evil comic book scientist. I'm just quoting Wikipedia on this because I cannot improve on it. He was at first a good man who wanted to help humanity, but big business, bosses, and other concerns blocked and checked him and even called him mad, until, embittered, he turned against humanity and moved to Venus. He somehow held high status among the beings of the planet Venus. And in Captain Marvel's first comic, he holds radio broadcasts hostage. Comics. In 1939, Superman was licensed to McClure Newspaper Syndicate, where a daily, including Sunday, strip was published. These pushed several aspects of the Superman mythos forward, including bald Lex Luthor due to a drawing mistake. They also fell under the copyright of 1909. Yes, copyright is back again! Copyright Act of 1909 continued one of the main flaws of the previous versions, namely, if something is published with improper or missing copyright, it goes immediately into the public domain. And McClure wasn't always the best at marking the comics copyright correctly. So Fawcett jumped on it. Sometimes the similarities were there, but not obvious. Other times, the comics they published were basically Superman comics, but rewritten and redrawn around Captain Marvel and Billy Batson, and their supporting characters. The Captain Marvel sales were similar to or exceeding Superman's. What were National Comics, what's now known as DC Comics, going to do? sue them? Yes, they did. DC sued Fawcett in 1951, arguing that Captain Marvel and the Marvel family, Captain Marvel Jr. and Mary Marvel among them, were just copyright violations of Superman. Like, sure, Billy Batson may be a kid, but he and Clark Kent were both reporters. Both had costumes based on circus strongmen. Both had similar powers and evil scientist villains. Some kid off the street could very easily pick up a Captain Marvel comic and think it was a Superman comic. Fawcett argued back that the improper copyright and trademark meant it didn't matter. McClure didn't write the copyright correctly. All of Superman was in public domain. After all, that's what the 1909 law said. Things rapidly got more convoluted. Witnesses often contradicted each other on if Captain Marvel artists were told to draw him like Superman. Captain Marvel in 1941 became the first comic book superhero with a live-action adaptation that was very similar to Superman's stuff in general. In fact, it started as a Superman serial. But the Superman contract at the time had given Superman theatrical rights to Fleischer and their animated works. Superman did eventually get a live-action series in 1948. In fact, one of the few obvious differences that came out between Captain Marvel and Superman is that while Superman has his love interest, Lois Lane, Billy Batson does not. He's 12. His female lead, Mary Marvel, is his sister, not his love interest. Versions vary if they are foster or birth siblings. Not mentioned in the court case, but I have to put this somewhere, Captain Marvel's evil doppelganger, Black Adam, at the very least predates Superman's doppelganger, Bizarro. Black Adam debuted in 1945, Bizarro in 1958. By the end of it, the judge decided it was a wash. Captain Marvel absolutely was stealing from Superman. But the copyright was not applied correctly, so it didn't matter. Everything was public domain since the contract that McClure signed with DC put them at an equal level of responsibility for Superman instead of McClure paying a fee to license Superman to use in their comics. Also, that the books were part of the 1909 copyright law did include comics. They filled the same niche. But that wasn't the end of it. DC ended up appealing the case, and this is where it proved important for copyright law. The Circuit Court, yes, where I get the podcast name, ruled something very important. Namely, just because the copyright was improperly applied, it didn't apply to everything. The copyrights were enforced inconsistently, but the fact they continued to exist in some form meant that McClure had intended to keep the copyright. It was not abandoned. And just because McClure didn't quite do it right, it didn't apply to everything with Superman and DC. McClure just licensed it. So, the comics with improper copyright are in the public domain, but that's just those specific comic strips. And the two companies can hash out the details on powers and so on if anyone wanted to appeal. No one wanted to appeal. Fawcett had lost the most important battle. Captain Marvel was a copy of Superman. So, Wiz Comics closed up shop. All the comics, even ones unrelated to Captain Marvel, ended, were licensed, or sold off. Charlton Comics got most of them, and Fawcett itself eventually closed in the 1970s. But if you are at this point going, wait, what about that movie with Brie Larson for Marvel? Yep, it pops in now. In 1967, Marvel Comics realized something important. The trademark for Captain Marvel was abandoned. Fawcett wasn't touching it. Charlton wasn't publishing it. Neither was DC. And hey, in 1961 they had renamed themselves to Marvel. So why don't they just submit something to the U.S. Copyright and Trademark Office? In 1967, Mar-Vell, a male Kree alien military officer, debuted in Marvel Comics. He fights to defend Earth from alien invasions and was popular enough to have a spin-off character in Carol Danvers, who eventually took up the name Ms. Marvel and had her own adventures. Sales flagged in the late 70s, and he was eventually killed off in a special series in the 80s. Because you see, the thing about trademarks is while they can hypothetically last in perpetuity, you have to use them to do that. That's how Marvel picked up the Captain Marvel trademark, and DC wanted it back. Yes, DC. After 20 years, DC decided to license Captain Marvel and fold him into the DC roster. I'm once again going to quote Wikipedia because any attempt at explaining this otherwise won't get the sheer comic book logic of this across. The character's 20-year absence from publication was explained as the result of Dr. Sivana and the Sivana family having trapped the Marvels and their friends, other superheroes, and by accident themselves in a sphere of suspendium, due to Sivana Jr. distracting Dr. Sivana by slapping him on the back in congratulations and making him crash the spaceship into the suspendium sphere, a compound that kept them in suspended animation from 1953 till 1973. They were released when the suspendium sphere neared the sun, melting it enough that Captain Marvel was revived. He and the other Marvels then pushed it back to Earth. However, there was a problem with the DC plan. The Fawcett characters could still all have the Captain Marvel name, and Marvel and the other Captain Marvels were different enough from Superman that it wasn't a problem. But the comic book itself, no. It had to go by a different name. And the one DC picked was Shazam, which, to be fair, worked great as a title. But there is some dissonance to read about a hero named Captain Marvel, and the word Shazam was just his transformation code word. DC has tried a few times to rename him to Shazam, but it never really stuck. DC, from the 70s until the 90s, would license Captain Marvel from Fawcett Comics until they eventually bought the character outright. Due to the license per use agreement, Captain Marvel was used sparingly, especially in media such as the DC Animated Universe, where he only appeared in a few episodes of Justice League, though he made an impact in those. As for Marvel's Captain Marvel, every few years they get something. The next Captain Marvel was a black woman in the 80s named Monica Rambeau that ran the Avengers for a time. Yes, you met her in WandaVision. The name kept getting tossed around, mostly among aliens and when Marvel was at a risk of losing the trademark, until 2012. Carol Danvers took over the name. The MCU was coming in hot, women in comics were having a groundswell of support for characters, Carol's new painted flight suit costume debuted to near universal praise, and with a fantastic few arcs by Kelly Sue DeConnick, Carol Danvers took over the throne as her fans, the Carol Corps, cheered. And with her old title empty, a new character, Kamala Khan, the daughter of Pakistani immigrants, Muslim, and inhuman, something Marvel was pushing at the time because Disney didn't own the mutants, yes, that will be an episode, and possibly later a mutant, and most of all, a fangirl of Carol Danvers, took up her old title of Ms. Marvel to maybe even more acclaim. Both Captain Marvels made their true film debut in 2019, and adjusted for inflation, Carol Danvers' $1.34 billion, or almost 7 Saharas, handedly beat Billy Batson's $452 million, or 2.3 Saharas. But Billy's scored better on Rotten Tomatoes. And yes, Billy's was named Shazam. And that's where we leave it now. I doubt Marvel is going to let DC ever have this again. Not unless we have another comic book crash. And while Billy Batson has his fans, when I told my grandfather how I was going to see Shazam, he told me how he and his friends would pretend to be Captain Marvel from the serials and run around the park, a story he had never told me before. Roughly 40 years of copyright complications means Billy never got to evolve like the other heroes, and he only gets known as the knockoff Superman when he does appear. Meanwhile, Carol and Kamala may be well liked in the comics world, but their movies or Disney Plus shows never let the parts that people like about them truly shine. And Carol is just one person to carry the moniker. Marvel has no issue having her go back to a previous identity and let someone else take it up. They've done it before. At least, at the end of the day, the story about how all of them came to be is just as interesting as the stories in their books. Thank you for listening to Circuit Court Entertainment. If you found this episode interesting, please tell others as this is a new podcast. Please subscribe and leave a review on all the major podcast services. You can find me on Twitter at CCEPod and Tumblr at Circuit Court Entertainment. This episode was written, edited, and recorded by me, Mina. The script was edited by CJ Peterson. Podcast art by Empress Cirque on Twitter. Thank you for your time, and I hope to hear from you soon.